Phone has been ringing for 11 minutes. I know because I've been counting, and counting is the only thing keeping my hand steady around this coffee mug. Margaret's name flashes across the screen for the fourth time, then Caleb's, then a number I do not recognize. Somewhere behind those calls, 200 miles from this lake in a country club ballroom filled with 300 guests dressed in linen and pearls, my husband's family is watching everything they built collapse in real time, and they think I did it to them. They think I planned every second of this. But here is what they do not know. I have been sitting at this table for 6 weeks waiting for a sealed envelope to catch up with a lie that is 12 years old. I did not write what was inside that envelope. I did not call whatever auditor just walked into their celebration. All I did was wait for the truth to arrive on its own schedule instead of mine. They paid me $2 million to disappear. They had no idea that money would be the very thing that brought me back. My name is Abigail, and this is the story of how a family tried to erase me, and how silence became the most powerful weapon I had ever held. I am sitting at a small pine table in a cabin I bought for myself in Door County, Wisconsin 3 years ago. Back then I thought it would be a weekend escape, a place to breathe when the weight of being a Jenkins became too heavy. I never imagined I would be living here full time. I never imagined a lot of things that turned out to be true. Through the window the water sits flat and silver under a sky that cannot decide whether it wants to rain. It is a Saturday morning in early June, the kind of morning that used to mean nothing more than opening the windows and letting the lake air drift through the house. But today, 200 miles south, the Jenkins family is hosting the most important event of the decade. A celebration. A coronation, really. 300 guests have gathered at Larkspur Country Club to watch William Jenkins formally hand his company to his oldest son. There are place cards and a string quartet. There's a cake with a small gold J on top because apparently even an unborn baby needs a monogram in that family. I know all of this because my attorney Rachel Hayes told me the itinerary 2 days ago, in the flat, careful voice she uses when she is trying not to let her opinions show. She has been my lawyer for 11 years, and I have never heard her sound as tired as she did on that call. "You do not have to go," she said. I was not planning to, I told her, and I meant it. Because the version of me who would have shown up, the version who spent 23 years learning how to make herself smaller in that family's presence, that version does not live here anymore. Phone lights up again. Margaret. I let it ring 3 times before I answer. There's a version of me who would have picked up on the first ring. She's gone now too. Abigail. Margaret's voice arrives clipped and imperial, the way it always does when she is frightened and trying not to show it. "Where are you?" "Somewhere you paid me quite a lot of money to disappear from," I say. 6 weeks ago, if memory serves. There is noise behind her. Chairs, scraping, a man's voice rising and falling. Someone saying the word auditor like it is a curse. I picture the ballroom, the flowers wilting slightly under the heat of too many bodies, the string quartet faltering mid-phrase, because nobody told them to stop. Madison somewhere near the front, in a pale blue dress, one hand resting on a belly that has become in the last 6 months the single most valuable asset the Jenkins family owns. "There has been a complication," Margaret says. "Something about a transfer. I need you to come explain it." "Explain what exactly?" "The $2 million, Abigail. Someone at the bank is asking questions about where it came from." I look down at the folder sitting on the table in front of me, thin and unremarkable, the kind of folder that could hold anything. Tax documents. A grocery list. The end of a marriage. I already know what is inside it. I have known for 3 days. "That is strange," I say. "I was under the impression it came from your family's pockets. Is that not what the paperwork said?" Silence. Then more noise. Caleb's voice, now sharp and close, wrestling the phone away from his mother. "Abigail, what did you do?" I picture him too easily. Jaw tight, collar too snug. The particular flush he gets when something is not going according to plan. 23 years of marriage teaches you a man's face, even when you cannot see it. "I did not do anything, Caleb," I say, and I mean it. "I have been sitting at the lake all morning. I did not write whatever letter just arrived at that club. I did not call whatever bank flagged whatever it flagged. All I did was wait." "You knew," he says. "It is not a question." "I knew what was possible," I say. "You are the one who decided to believe the rest." But to understand what is happening in that ballroom right now, to understand why 300 people just watched a family's future shatter over a sealed envelope, you have to go back to the night it all began. The night they called me to the house. The night I learned exactly how little I was worth to them, and exactly how much they still did not know. 6 weeks earlier, Caleb came home at 11 o'clock at night, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he did not bother pretending he'd been at the office. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, still wearing his suit jacket tie loosened, and said it the way you would announce a merger. "Madison is pregnant." I was sitting up in bed with a book I was not really reading. I remember setting it down slowly, giving myself a half-second to arrange my face before I looked at him. 23 years of marriage teaches you things about timing. It teaches you when to speak and when to let silence do the work for you. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it to sting, though I am not sure it landed the way I intended. He did not flinch. That was the part that told me how far things had already gone without me. "It is a boy," he said, like the sex of the child settled something. "Family needs to move quickly before this gets out." By the family, he meant his family. The Jenkinses, the name that had been stamped on everything I'd touched for over 2 decades, but had never truly belonged to me. By move quickly, I would learn within the hour he meant me. They sent a car for me that same night. Not Caleb driving, the Jenkins family car, black and silent, as if I were already a piece of business to be transported rather than a wife to be spoken with. I remember looking out the window at the streets of the city I had lived in for 20 years, and thinking how strange it was that none of it looked different when everything about my life was about to change. Psychologists have a term for this. They call it the doorway effect. The moment you cross a threshold, your brain begins to reset, preparing itself for a new chapter before you have even finished the old one. Sitting in the back of that car watching streetlights slide past the glass, I felt it happening. Something inside me shifting, closing a door I would never walk back through. The house on Willamere Drive was lit up when I arrived, every window glowing like they were staging something for a magazine, and in a sense they were. They were staging my disappearance. The living room held Margaret in a chair positioned like a throne, William in his usual place by the fireplace, though he did not rise when I entered, Caleb standing too close to Madison on the sofa, and Charles Whitmore, the family attorney, seated at the low table with a leather folder already open in front of him. Madison had one hand resting on her stomach, though she could not have been more than 8 or 9 weeks along. It was a gesture, not a fact. I noticed immediately how practiced it looked, how rehearsed, the way an actress places her hand on a prop to remind the audience what the scene is about. Charles slid the folder toward me before anyone said hello. $2 million. 7 days to vacate the house. Silence on the affair, permanent and binding. No contact with press. A full release of any claim to marital assets. No objection ever to Caleb's remarriage. I read every line twice while the room watched me. Here is something most people do not understand about moments like this. When a family with that kind of money decides to remove you, they do not do it with emotion. They do it with paperwork. The cruelty is not in the words anyone says. It is in the precision of the document. Every clause designed to make you feel like a problem being solved rather than a person being discarded. This is more than most women your age could hope to walk away with, Margaret said, folding her hands in her lap like she was doing me a kindness. Let me tell you something about that sentence. Most women your age, 4 words, contain an entire philosophy about what a woman is worth once she passes a certain number. Margaret said it the way you would quote a market price, as if my value had been objectively assessed, and this was a generous offer above asking. Madison chose the exact moment to let a tear slide down her cheek, and Margaret reached over without looking to pat her knee, already choosing sides in a war that had not started for me yet. "I do not want to hurt you," Caleb said, and for 1 second I almost believed there was something underneath the words. "But this is the family's future," he said. "Are you certain?" "It is yours," I asked. The room went still, a particular kind of still that fills a space right before someone raises their voice. Caleb's face darkened. "Are you going to insult the mother of my child in this house?" Madison cried harder right on cue, and Margaret was at her side instantly, murmuring something protective. But I was not trying to insult anyone. I was asking the only question that mattered, and the fact that it made the whole room flinch told me more than any answer could have. I did not argue. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with a room that has already decided the ending only wastes your breath. Instead, I made my own requests. I wanted the full $2 million wired that same night, not staggered, not delayed. I wanted every document notarized before I left the house. I wanted explicit language stating the payment did not touch any business shares held in my name, and I wanted it written that no terms could be altered after signing. Charles skimmed the shares clause quickly and told the room my holdings were negligible, a formality left over from the early years. Margaret, eager to be finished with me, agreed without argument. I signed. Madison smiled the way a woman smiles when she believes she has just won something permanent. She had no idea she had just handed me the only weapon I would ever need. Habits held like a man who had been holding his breath for days. Margaret told me she knew I would do the sensible thing. "You never actually knew me," I told her, and I watched that lens somewhere behind her eyes, though she would never have admitted it. Caleb followed me out to the car. He asked why I was not screaming, why I was not begging him to reconsider, why I was not behaving like a woman whose marriage had just ended in a room full of witnesses. "Because I stopped fighting for things that had already lost their value," I said, and got into the car before he could find a response. The door closed. The car pulled away from the house I had spent 18 years turning into a home, and for the first time in 23 years I breathed like a woman who had nothing left to lose. That is the most dangerous kind of woman in the world. The money landed in my account before midnight, exactly as I had demanded. I sat at my kitchen table, still my kitchen, for 6 more days, and went through the wire details with that kind of attention I had once used auditing the company's quarterly filings. Back when Caleb still asked for my opinion instead of assuming I had none. Receipt, routing number, timestamp, fund of origin, And that is where everything changed. The $2 million did not come from Margaret's personal account. It did not come from William's either. It came from the Jenkins Legacy Trust, a fund reserved by charter for a confirmed future heir. I sat with that fact for a long time in the quiet kitchen, turning it over the way you would turn over a stone to see what is living underneath. Then I picked up my phone and called Rachel Hayes. They just paid me, I told her, with money set aside for a child who has not been proven to belong to this family yet. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I will never forget. That is not a settlement, Abigail. That is a mistake. And mistakes like that do not stay buried. But the wire transfer was not the only secret sitting quietly in that kitchen. There was another one. Older, heavier, one I had carried for 12 years without telling a single soul outside of 2 people. 12 years ago, Caleb had been diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. It caught him young, before 40, and it frightened him in a way I had never seen before or since. He went through treatment, quietly telling no one outside our marriage, terrified of what his father would think of a son who could not even keep his own body from failing him. In a family like the Jenkinses, vulnerability is not forgiven. It is catalogued, filed away, used later when leverage is needed. So Caleb hid it, and I helped him hide it because that is what wives do when they still believe the marriage is worth protecting. When the treatment was over, the follow-up results came back clear on the cancer. But there was another line in the report. One Caleb read 3 times before he could speak. Permanent infertility. A result of the treatment. The doctors were clear. The odds of Caleb fathering a biological child after what his body had been through were so close to 0, they might as well have been written in stone. Only 3 people ever knew. Caleb, myself, and Dr. Laura Bennett, who had cared for both of us for over a decade. Caleb made me promise more than once that his family would never learn it, and I understood why. In that family, a man who could not produce an heir was worth less than the furniture. So when he stood in our bedroom doorway 6 weeks ago and told me Madison was pregnant, told me it was a boy, told me the family needed to move quickly, I already knew something he had chosen to forget. It was not biologically possible. Only 3 people in the world knew the truth. One of them was sitting across from a woman who had just claimed the impossible, and neither Caleb nor Madison had any idea I was holding the match that would burn their entire story to the ground. But here's the thing about carrying a secret that long. You learn patience. Not the kind of patience that comes from waiting in line or sitting through a long meeting. The kind that comes from watching a lie grow roots, and knowing that one day, no matter how deep those roots go, the ground beneath them will shift. There is a psychological phenomenon researchers call confirmation bias. It is the tendency to believe information that supports what you already want to be true, and to reject anything that contradicts it. Caleb wanted a son. He wanted it so badly that he stopped asking the questions he already knew the answers to. He convinced himself the old results did not hold anymore, that somehow this time things were different. Madison told him it happened at a conference months ago. He chose to believe her because the alternative meant admitting something about himself he had spent 12 years running from. I did not want to build anything on memory alone, though. 12-year-old paper was not proof of anything happening now. So I called Dr. Bennett that evening. She confirmed the old file was still in the system, though she could not discuss it without Caleb's consent. Doctor-patient privilege does not dissolve just because a marriage does. But there was something she did not need his consent to tell me. Years earlier, when we had tried fertility treatments together, I had been named as a joint party on those records. I still had legal access to a portion of that file. And then, almost as if the universe wanted to hand me one more piece of the puzzle, an email arrived from our old insurance provider. My name still had not been removed from the family policy in the confusion of the divorce filing. Buried in the notifications was a scheduling confirmation. Madison had booked a non-invasive prenatal paternity test. Results expected in 3 weeks. I read that line 4 times before I set the phone down. She was testing who the father was, which meant even Madison was not certain. Rachel warned me immediately. Do not tip them off. Do not warn anyone. Let them put the truth on paper themselves. Do not hand them a reason to bury it first. She was right, and I knew it. Even as some old tired part of me wanted to walk into that house and lay it all out just to watch their faces change. I did not. I had spent 23 years being patient with that family. I could manage 3 more weeks. While I waited, the Jenkins public relations machine started turning. Statements went out quietly through mutual friends. The marriage had been over in every way. The paper for years. I had taken the settlement out of self-interest. Caleb and Madison had found each other during a difficult chapter, and should not be judged for it. A photographer was already booked for a future generation announcement shoot. The story was being written in real time, and I was being edited out of it, one carefully worded paragraph at a time. But stories have a way of developing cracks when the foundation they are built on is not solid. 3 days before I left the hotel, a former colleague still working in the finance department called me. She said legal had quietly requested her to adjust the approval date on a wire transfer, my wire transfer, to make it look like it had cleared the board weeks earlier than it actually had. Someone was altering records. That was the moment I understood. They were not just hiding an affair anymore. They knew on some level that the transaction was not clean, and they were trying to cover it before anyone looked too closely. Meanwhile, Margaret called me asking me to sign an additional document, this one waiving my voting rights within the company entirely. I refused. That stake exists because of this family, she said, clearly startled that I had not simply agreed. No, I said. I bought it with my own money back when the company was nearly bankrupt, and nobody else wanted to risk a cent on it. Nobody gave me anything, Margaret. I earned every percentage point. There was a long pause on the line, and I could almost hear her doing the math. She should have done years earlier. 18%. That was what I still held quietly in a trust of my own, untouched by the divorce settlement, because I had made certain of it the night I signed those papers. They thought they bought my silence. They did not even read what I still owned. Without that 18%, Caleb could not reach the voting threshold he needed to replace William as chairman. The company could not move forward with a leadership transfer unless I cooperated, and I had no intention of cooperating. Not yet. He called me an hour later, furious. You tricked me. No, I said. You simply never read what I actually owned. There is a lesson in that, one that applies far beyond boardrooms and divorce settlements. People who are used to power often stop reading the fine print because they assume the details will always work in their favor. They forget that the person sitting quietly on the other side of the table might have been paying attention the entire time. That night a text arrived from a number I did not recognize. If you want to know who really approved the money, ask Owen where he was the night Madison says she can see it. Owen, Caleb's younger brother, the quiet one, the one who always stood slightly behind the spotlight, never quite demanding attention but never quite leaving the room either. I read the message twice, sitting alone in my hotel room with the hum of the highway outside the window, and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. The woman texted again the next morning asking to meet. She introduced herself as Claire Morris, an audit assistant in the finance division, someone I vaguely remember from company holiday parties. Always polite, always in the background, kind of employee who notices everything and says nothing until she has a reason to. Researchers who study corporate fraud have a term for people like Claire. They call them peripheral witnesses, the employees who sit close enough to power to see its machinery, but far enough from it that nobody thinks to watch what they are watching. Claire was not ready to meet in person yet, but she wanted me to have something first. Over the next 2 days she sent me pieces, one at a time, like she was testing whether I could be trusted with the whole picture before handing it over. Owen had requested elevated access to trust fund records 6 weeks before Madison's pregnancy became public. He had met with Madison multiple times outside any work schedule that made sense. There was a hotel charge in Milwaukee, the room booked under a name that did not match anyone on the guest list for that week's supposed business trip, and Caleb had not even been in Milwaukee the night Madison claimed the child was conceived. I did not believe it right away. 23 years with a man teaches you his lies, but it also teaches you not to trust every accusation that lands on your desk, especially one from a stranger. So I checked it myself. I still had access to an old shared calendar, one nobody had thought to remove me from in the chaos of the divorce. The night in question, Caleb had been in Denver with William and 3 board members locked in meetings about a stalled development deal. I remembered him complaining about it at the time. The long flight, the tedious contract language, how he had missed my birthday dinner because of it. Madison had been in Milwaukee the same week. So had Owen. Once I let myself look, the smaller things came rushing back, things I had noticed and dismissed for years, without letting myself add them together. Owen always stepping in to defend Madison whenever Caleb criticized her work. Madison knowing details about deals that should have stayed inside Owen's office. The two of them leaving the same holiday party within minutes of each other more than once. Owen more than anyone pushing Caleb toward a fast, clean divorce. The man who had pushed hardest for my disappearance was the same man sleeping with my husband's mistress, and the child that was supposed to secure the Jenkins legacy might not have been a Jenkins at all. It might have been a weapon, designed by 2 people I had once trusted enough to invite into my home. There is a particular kind of betrayal that only happens within families. Strangers can hurt you, but they cannot use your own history as a blueprint for your destruction. Only someone who has sat at your table and learned where the walls are thin can do that. Rachel, when I called her, was more cautious than I was. Do not let this become a story you are telling yourself because it is satisfying, she said. We need documents. We need to test results. Speculation does not hold up in a courtroom, and it definitely does not hold up in that family. She was right, and I made myself sit with the discomfort of not knowing instead of rushing toward a conclusion that felt too convenient. Claire finally agreed to meet in person at a quiet diner off the interstate, the kind of place where the coffee is always burnt and nobody looks up from their plate long enough to notice who is sitting in the corner booth. She slid a manila envelope across the table, a copy of the trust's approval law, the Milwaukee hotel records, and a small digital recorder. She watched me carefully as I picked it up, the way you watch someone about to open a door they cannot close again. I pressed play right there in the booth. my coffee going cold in front of me. The first voice was Owen's, unmistakable, low and confident in the way men get when they think no one important is listening. We just need Caleb to believe the baby is his until the transfer of power is finalized. Madison's voice followed, quieter, and Abigail. $2 million will make her disappear. I sat very still, listening to my own erasure being planned in real time by two people I had once trusted. There's a moment in everyone's life when they hear something that rearranges every memory they have, every holiday dinner, every birthday, every time Owen had smiled at me across the table and asked how I was doing, every time Madison had complimented my dress or laughed at something I said. All of it were written in an instant, not as warmth but as calculation, not as family but as strategy. There was more on the recording, the sound of ice in a glass, a door closing somewhere in the background, and then Madison's voice again, this time with an edge I had not heard in her before, something colder underneath all that practiced softness. "And once Caleb has the company," she said, "what do we do with him?" That sentence landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. They were not just planning to remove me, they were planning to remove Caleb too, use him as a vehicle to seize power, and then discard him the same way they had discarded me. The only difference was that Caleb would not see it coming, because he was too busy believing in a child that was never his. I sat in that diner for a long time after Claire left, the recording finished, the coffee cold, the highway humming outside, and I thought about what it means to hold something as powerful in your hands. The temptation is to use it immediately, to walk into a room and detonate it like a bomb. But I had learned something over 23 years that most people never learn. The most powerful moment to reveal a truth is not when you are angry. It is when the lie has grown so large that the truth does not need your help anymore. It just needs a door. 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, the Jenkins family threw the kind of party they had always been good at. The kind built on white tablecloths and rehearsed smiles, where every detail existed to tell a story about who they were rather than who they actually were. 300 guests, board members, investors, banking partners, old money friends who had known William since his own father ran the company. The agenda was simple and triumphant. Announce that Madison was carrying a boy. Announce Caleb's engagement. Have William formally hand over the reins of the company to his son. Secure board approval for a new development phase. And present the unborn child as a living symbol of the family's stability for another generation. 300 people came dressed for a coronation. They witnessed a funeral instead. That morning, while the Jenkins family was adjusting centerpieces and rehearsing speeches, I sat with Rachel at my kitchen table going through 3 separate documents she had prepared and quietly filed the day before. A formal notice preserving my shareholder rights, a request for an internal audit of the trust transaction, a motion to delay any vote on transferring executive control until that audit concluded. Timing matters, Rachel had told me. We do not stop them. We make sure the truth arrives at the worst possible moment for them to hide it. It arrived just before William was set to speak. An auditor from a trust oversight firm walked into that ballroom, uninvited by anyone but the paperwork itself, and asked to speak with the board privately before the formal remarks began. Word of it moved through the room the way bad news always does at parties like that, in whispers, in glances, in the sudden stiffness of people trying to look like nothing was wrong. The auditor's findings were simple and devastating. The $2 million disbursement had been drawn improperly from a fund reserved for a verified heir. The approval signature bore signs of having been added after the fact, not during the original transaction window. Until the discrepancy was resolved, any transfer of executive power would need to be paused, and the identity of the future heir himself would need to be formally verified before any further trust decisions could proceed. While the board absorbed this, while Margaret tried to maintain the performance of calm while Caleb stood at the front of the room watching his coronation dissolve in real time, a courier arrived at the club with a sealed envelope addressed to Caleb personally. The prenatal paternity results, 3 weeks in the making, finally returned. Madison tried to intercept it. Caleb would not let her. He opened it standing in front of nearly 300 people. The room went silent, not the polite silence of an audience waiting for a speech. The airless silence of something breaking that can never be put back together. Caleb had been excluded as the biological father. And while I stood at my kitchen window, 200 miles away, watching the lake do what it always does, indifferent to everything happening in that ballroom, 300 people watched the Jenkins family's carefully constructed future collapse around a single piece of paper. Madison insisted the test had to be flawed, some kind of laboratory error, her voice rising toward hysteria in a room full of people who had come dressed for a celebration. Owen tried to slip toward the exit. William, apparently moving faster than anyone expected from a 76-year-old man, physically blocked the door. Nobody was leaving. Not yet. The auditor clarified calmly that the confidence level in the results was extremely high, and that an expanded comparison panel indicated a close male relative of Caleb's was significantly more likely to be the biological father. Every eye in that ballroom turned to Owen. He denied it, too quickly, the way guilty men always do. That was when I sent the recording. Claire's recording. The one where Owen tells Madison they only need Caleb to believe the child is his until the transfer of power is complete. Rachel told me later that William listened to the whole thing standing perfectly still in the middle of that ruined ballroom, his face unreadable, before he finally looked at his younger son and said nothing at all. Caleb lunged at Owen. Security stepped between them. Madison broke down completely, and in the chaos, she finally admitted what should have been obvious from the beginning. She had been with both brothers, but it was Owen who had helped her plan every step of what came after. 200 miles away, I sat at my kitchen table, the phone dark, the coffee cold, the lake still moving outside like nothing in the world had changed, and I thought about how strange it is that the biggest moments of your life sometimes happen in rooms you are not even in. 3 days after the party, the family called an emergency meeting at the Jenkins Development Group headquarters. And this time, for the first time in 23 years, I walked into that building not as anyone's wife, but as a shareholder with a claim they could no longer dismiss. The conference room on the 14th floor held more people than I had ever seen gathered for a single crisis. Caleb sat at one end, jaw set, refusing to look at his brother. Owen sat with his own attorney, a stranger I did not recognize, which told me everything about how far things had already fractured within that family. Margaret occupied her usual chair, though for one she looked smaller in it. William sat at the head of the table, his face carved from something harder than I had seen before. Madison had come too, pale, her hands folded over a stomach that had become in the space of 1 week evidence rather than triumph. Charles Whitmore sat beside a bank representative, and an auditor, both of whom looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Rachel sat beside me. I had asked her to let me speak for myself. Owen tried first to shift the blame entirely onto Madison, his voice clipped and defensive, insisting he had only ever offered her advice as a friend. Madison was not having it. She turned on him with a bitterness that finally sounded honest. Performance stripped away for good. He promised he would marry me, she said, once Caleb was pushed out of the company. The plan, once it came apart fully on that table, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Use the child to accelerate Caleb into the chairman's seat. Once he held power, Owen would use the financial irregularities he himself had helped create to force his brother out under a cloud of scandal. Madison would threaten to expose the affair if anyone resisted, and Owen, positioned as the reasonable and involved brother throughout, would step in to take control of the company himself. It was a coup designed to look like a natural succession, a betrayal wearing the mask of family loyalty. The $2 million had been the opening move, pulled from the trust specifically to remove me from the marriage and from any position to interfere. What none of them had accounted for was that I still held 18% of the company, and with it the standing to demand everything I had just demanded. I laid out what I wanted, and I did it without raising my voice, because I had learned a long time ago that calm carries further in a room built on power than anger ever could. The company would issue a public correction, no more implying I had taken a payout for silence. The confidentiality agreement I had signed would be rewritten so it could never again be used to bury wrongdoing. The $2 million would be reclassified as a legitimate personal settlement drawn from Caleb's and the family's own assets, with full repayment made to the trust. Owen would be suspended pending a formal investigation. Madison would be released from her position, though her medical and maternity coverage would remain fully protected. I said that clearly and without hesitation. None of this was the child's fault. The baby does not answer for the lies that brought him into the world. Caleb would not be appointed chairman. An independent director would run the company for no less than a year, and I would keep my shares along with my seat on the board. Margaret's composure finally cracked. "You are punishing us," she said. "This is revenge." I lifted her across the table, the woman who had sat in her living room chair like a throne and told me $2 million was more than most women my age could hope for. "Revenge is wanting you to suffer," I said. "I only want you to stop using my name to cover up what you did." Caleb asked to speak with me privately. I let him, mostly because I wanted to see once and for all what was actually left of the men I had married. He asked quietly if there had ever been a point where I had tried to save our marriage. "I saved it for 23 years, I told him. You just never noticed because I did it quietly," he admitted then, in a voice stripped of all its usual certainty that he had known for a long time. His odds of fathering a child were nearly non-existent, but he had wanted so badly to prove something to his father that he chose to believe Madison anyway, chose to stop asking the questions that would have unraveled everything sooner. "You did not love the baby," I said. "You loved what you thought the baby would prove about you." He had nothing to say to that. William, when the vote finally came, refused to hand control to either son. He cast his vote for the independent director instead, his voice flat and final. A man closing a chapter he had clearly been rewriting in his head all week. Every condition I had laid out was approved without further argument. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, Caleb caught up with me one last time. "After all this," he said, "you are still keeping the $2 million. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once been my whole life and was now something closer to a stranger, standing in a hallway. "No," I said, "I have decided to use it for something your family never understood. I never gave the $2 million back to Caleb. Under the terms we had settled on in that conference room, the Jenkins family repaid the trust fund from their own personal holdings dollar for dollar, exactly as it should have been from the start. What I received that first night was legally and finally mine. Clean. Documented. No longer tangled up in anyone else's lie. I did not buy a bigger house with it. I did not buy a car meant to announce anything to anyone. Instead, I sat at the same pine table where this whole story had circled back to its beginning, and I started something. It came to me almost fully formed the way true things sometimes do. A second chapter fund. It exists for women over 45 who find themselves starting over after everything they built quietly falls apart around them. After divorce, after financial control wielded like a weapon, after being pushed out of family businesses they helped create, after years spent raising children or supporting a spouse's career only to re-enter a workforce that has forgotten they exist. There is a statistic that still keeps me up at night. Women over 50 who go through divorce experience an average income drop of 41%. Men of the same age experience a drop of 23%. The gap is not an accident. It is a mathematical residue of a system that rewards visible work and punishes the invisible kind. The kind I did for 23 years. Legal consultation, career retraining, short-term housing assistance, financial planning, counseling for the kind of grief that does not come with a funeral. That is what the fund provides. Because starting over at 25 looks like an adventure. Starting over at 55 looks like a cliff. And someone needs to be standing at the edge saying, it is not a cliff, it is a door. I kept my seat on the Jenkins Development Group board because 18% does not disappear just because a marriage does. And because someone needed to make sure the company's new independent director actually held to the terms we had agreed on. I did not go back to running things day to day. That chapter had already closed itself quietly over 23 years of me standing just behind the curtain. Caleb resigned as CEO 6 months later. He moved into a small apartment across town and started seeing a therapist, something I never once heard him consider necessary during our entire marriage. I do not know if it is helping him. I have stopped needing to know. Owen was formally charged with financial misconduct, falsifying trust records, and misappropriating funds meant for a beneficiary who never existed. The case is still working its way through the courts. Madison gave birth to a healthy boy that autumn. The DNA results, once fully processed, confirmed what the ballroom had already guessed. Owen was the father. I do not hate the child. I want to be clear about that. A baby does not answer for the lies that brought him into the world. He came into this family the way all children do, innocent of everything that happened before him. Margaret lost most of her influence within the company almost overnight. The way power always seems to when it turns out to have been built on something hollow. William, for his part, restructured the trust entirely, placing it under independent oversight so that no single family member could ever again decide alone who deserved to be called an heir. A year after that ballroom fell silent around a sealed envelope, I stood in the small office we had rented for the fund's first real headquarters. Nothing fancy, just clean walls and good light, and a row of chairs for women who would arrive not knowing quite how to ask for help. The first woman who walked through that door was 56 years old. The widow, 3 months out from discovering her late husband had quietly left the bulk of his estate to a second family she had not known existed. I sat down beside her instead of across from her, because I remembered what it felt like to be spoken to like a problem instead of a person. Starting over does not mean you have lost everything, I told her. Sometimes it just means you finally get to keep the one thing that was always actually yours. Yourself. That evening I drove back out to the lake house. The folder labeled Jenkins Divorce still sitting in a drawer I had not opened in months. I set a new folder down beside it. Second chapter fund, first year. My phone buzzed on the table. It was not Caleb. It was not Margaret. It never is anymore. It was a message from one of our caseworkers. A woman we had helped in March had just accepted a job offer. Her first paycheck in 11 years. I smiled at that. Alone in the quiet. The light going dark and gold outside the window, the way it does every evening around this time on this lake in this cabin that was supposed to be my exile, but turned out to be my beginning. They thought $2 million was the price of making me disappear. It turned out to be the money that finally let me show up, not as anyone's wife, not as anyone's problem, but as the woman I had been putting off becoming for more than 20 years. 23 years of marriage taught me many things. It taught me timing. It taught me patience. It taught me how to read a room and when to leave one. But the most important thing it taught me was this. The people who try hardest to make you small are always the ones most afraid of what will happen when you stand at your full height. They were right to be afraid. If you were Abigail, would you have signed those papers and let the truth expose itself in its own time? Or would you have confronted Caleb the moment he walked through that door? I want to know where the story finds you tonight. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what you would have done differently. We have new stories like this one waiting for you every day, so subscribe and stay close, because this is only the beginning of the journeys we will take together.